There is a document somewhere in a French company's archive that lists 7 names. Next to each name, a salary, a contract, a return date. 3 of those people never came back. One was a woman, 8 months pregnant, who gave birth on a volcanic rock in the southern Indian Ocean with no doctor, no medicine, and no way to call for help. Her baby lived for 3 weeks. The company knew she was there. The company did not come. This is not a story about a shipwreck. There was no storm that swept them off course, no dramatic disaster to explain what happened. 7 people were left on an island on purpose, by people in offices who decided that a lobster factory was worth more than a human life, and then decided, when it became inconvenient, to simply wait a little longer before sending the ship back. The ocean didn't kill them. A spreadsheet did. St. Paul Island does not look like a place where people die. From a distance, from the deck of a ship passing through the southern Indian Ocean, it looks almost picturesque, a volcanic crater rising from the water, green edges where vegetation manages to cling, the white of surf against dark rock. It looks like one of those remote places that appear on travel programs hosted by people who have never had to stay. Get closer, and the picture changes. The sea around St. Paul is not the sea you imagine when you close your eyes and think of the ocean. This is the southern Indian Ocean, one of the most consistently violent bodies of water on the planet. Swells travel thousands of kilometers without interruption, building energy across open water until they arrive at St. Paul and break against its cliffs with the kind of force that doesn't negotiate. There is no harbor to speak of. No sheltered bay where a boat can sit without anxiety. No freshwater stream running down from higher ground. No fruit trees, no vegetable garden growing wild, no forest to cut for timber or shelter. What St. Paul has is lobster. Millions of spiny lobster in the waters surrounding the island, one of the densest concentrations in the southern hemisphere. And in the late 1920s, a French company called Langoustes Françaises, which translates, with a kind of cruel irony, simply as French lobster, decided that this abundance was an opportunity that distance should not be allowed to prevent. The company was run by 2 brothers. Businessmen. The kind of men who look at a map and see not a place but a resource. They recruited fishermen from Brittany and the southwest coast of England, men who knew what it meant to earn your living from water that doesn't care whether you survive. They built a factory on the northern shore of St. Paul. Machines for processing. Storage for tin and salt. The infrastructure of extraction, bolted to a rock that had never asked to be industrialized. For one season, it worked. The catch was extraordinary. Tens of thousands of lobsters a day, by some accounts. The factory ran. The tins filled. The brothers, far away in comfort, had numbers to admire. Here is the thing about numbers. They have a way of replacing the reality they represent. When you are looking at a ledger showing tens of thousands of lobsters per day, you are not thinking about the men hauling them from violent water. You are not thinking about what it means to work and sleep and eat on a volcanic island with no trees and no running water. The numbers are clean. The island is not. They returned the following year with more workers and grander ambitions. This time they brought men not only from France but from Madagascar, men drawn by the gravity of wages in a Depression-era world where work of any kind was not something you turned down without consequence. 100 men working a place that could barely support the idea of a single family. And then, in the middle of the season, a fire. It moved through the storage area and destroyed most of the food supply. Think about what that means on an island with no shops, no neighboring community, no supply run possible in less than weeks. A fire on the mainland is a disaster. A fire on St. Paul is a different kind of event entirely. It is not a loss of convenience. It is the beginning of a calculation: how many people, how much food remaining, how many days until the ship comes, that you do not want to be making on a volcanic island in the southern Indian Ocean. The company noted the fire. The company continued the season. When March 1930 arrived and the season ended, the workers were loaded onto the ship. The catch was loaded. The equipment stayed behind, too valuable to remove, too expensive to abandon. The factory building stayed. The machinery stayed. And the company made a decision. Someone needed to stay. Not many people. Just enough to guard the factory through the southern winter. To keep the equipment maintained. To prevent the island, which had already shown a distinct talent for reclaiming anything humans left unattended, from dismantling what the company had invested in. 3 months. That was the promise. A supply ship would come in 3 months. It was, the company said, a short posting. An inconvenience, nothing more. 7 people agreed to stay. 6 men, fishermen, workers, men with the particular kind of toughness that comes from spending your life in weather that doesn't care about you. And 1 woman. Louise. 8 months pregnant. Read that again, slowly. A company left a woman who was 8 months pregnant on a remote volcanic island in the southern Indian Ocean with 6 other people, a handful of canned food, 4 pigs, 8 goats, and a radio transmitter that none of them, not one of the 7, knew how to operate. And then the ship left. Why did they agree? This is the question that the records cannot fully answer, and it is worth sitting with rather than rushing past. Perhaps they needed the money. Perhaps they trusted the promise. 3 months is short enough to be imagined as an inconvenience rather than a danger. Perhaps Louise and Victor, her husband, made the calculation that 2 of them together could manage anything for 12 weeks. Perhaps they didn't feel they had the kind of choice that looks like choice from the outside. What is certain is that they watched the ship go. They stood on the shore of St. Paul Island, 7 people, a factory they were being paid to protect, and 3 months of food, and they listened to the sound of the engines fade until there was nothing left but the wind and the surf. The island, which had no opinion about any of this, continued doing what it had always done. In the beginning, there was still the structure of a deadline. 3 months is short enough to organize yourself around. You ration. You establish routines. You patch the shelters against weather that arrives without warning. You learn the rhythms of the place, the way the wind shifts at a certain hour, the way the surf pattern changes before a storm, the way the light looks different on days when fishing might be possible and days when the sea will take you if you try. They fished when the water allowed it. They hunted what the island offered, penguins and their eggs, which the island had in abundance and which no one who has a choice eats for months on end. The pigs and goats wandered the spare volcanic ground, turning what little vegetation existed into meat for a future that was beginning to feel less defined than anyone had expected. Then Louise went into labor. March 26, 1930. A date that exists in the records with the flatness of fact, which does not prepare you for what it represents. A woman giving birth on a volcanic island, attended by men who were fishermen, not doctors. No medical equipment beyond what chance and a basic supply kit might provide. No anesthetic. No way to call for help if something went wrong. The nearest doctor was not hours away, he was weeks away, on the other side of an ocean that does not guarantee passage. Louise delivered a boy. They named him Paul, perhaps after the island, perhaps because in extremity names carry the weight of everything that words cannot say. Paul lived for 3 weeks. The causes that likely killed him are straightforward to list and impossible to fully absorb: malnutrition in his mother's diet affecting his development, exposure to conditions that a newborn body cannot manage, infection in an environment with no means of treatment. Each cause alone might have been survivable. Together they were not. They buried Paul in the volcanic earth of St. Paul Island. There were no flowers. There was no wood for a marker that would outlast the wind. Louise stood at the grave of her child on a rock in the southern Indian Ocean, and the horizon in every direction was empty, and the ship was not coming for 2 more months. What do you do with that? Seriously, what do you do? You keep going. Because the alternative is not keeping going, and that is not an option when you still have people around you who need you to function. June came. Then July. The 3 months became 4, then 5. The supplies that had seemed calculated for the posting began to reveal themselves as something else, sufficient for 3 months if nothing went wrong, catastrophically insufficient for anything longer. The pigs were slaughtered. The goats were slaughtered. Meals were supplemented with whatever the island and the sea would provide: penguins, penguin eggs, fish when the surf allowed it, and something that appeared in the records with a matter-of-factness that says everything about how far from normal life they had traveled: rats. The rats that had arrived on the island the way rats always arrive, on ships, in cargo, uninvited but persistent, had made St. Paul their home. They were not in the factory stores anymore, because the factory stores were largely empty. They were everywhere. And when you have been on an island for 5 months with dwindling food and a 3-month promise that no one seems to be honoring, a rat is not a symbol of desperation. It is dinner. Canned meat remained, the great convenience of the industrial age, preserved and portable. They ate it. It kept them alive. And it was doing something they could not see and did not yet understand. It was removing, one meal at a time, something their bodies needed to survive. Canned food in 1930, salted meat, preserved provisions with no fresh component, was nutritionally sufficient for weeks, not months. For a body doing physical work in a cold, exposed environment, the absence of vitamin C is not immediately obvious. It accumulates. It works slowly, like debt. On July 4th, Emmanuel became ill. It began as fatigue, which, on St. Paul after 5 months, was the baseline condition of everyone. Hard to isolate. Easy to dismiss. But Emmanuel's legs began to swell. His skin yellowed. He lost his appetite. He could no longer urinate properly. The others watched with the specific helplessness of people who understand that something serious is happening and have nothing to offer it. They opened the medical book. Imagine that moment. 6 people on a volcanic island, one of them clearly dying, opening a book to find out what is wrong and what to do about it. The diagnosis looking back at them from the page was almost insulting in its historical familiarity. Scurvy. The disease of old ships and long voyages. The disease that had killed sailors for centuries before anyone understood that the solution was a lemon. Scurvy is not dramatic. It does not take you quickly. It is the body systematically dismantling itself because a single essential compound is absent, vitamin C, which connective tissue requires to hold itself together. Without it, the seams of the body come undone. Gums bleed. Old wounds reopen. Joints swell and ache with a specific, deep pain. The mind dims. And then, eventually, the body runs out of margin. St. Paul had no citrus. No fresh vegetables. No vitamin C hiding anywhere in its volcanic soil or its penguin population. The medical book told them what Emmanuel had. It did not tell them how to fix it, because on St. Paul, there was no way to fix it. 2 weeks after the first symptoms appeared, Emmanuel died. Shortly after, Francois showed the same progression. By then the survivors understood, knowing the name of what was killing them made it no less effective. Scurvy does not respond to understanding. It responds to fresh food, and there was none. Francois died at the end of August. 6 months after the ship had left. Victor, Louise's husband, the father of the child they had buried in the volcanic earth, followed. 7 became 4. And the ship had not come. Here is what 6 months of scurvy, insufficient food, grief, and a broken promise does to a person's relationship with time. It makes it stop meaning what it used to mean. A day is no longer a unit of progress toward something. It is a unit of endurance, something to get through, to survive, to add to the accumulating number of days that the company's ship has failed to appear. The horizon becomes both the most important thing in your world and the thing you learn, gradually and then completely, not to trust. October arrived. Pierre went out to fish. The weather was bad, but on St. Paul bad weather is ordinary and the need for food is absolute. He did not come back. The ocean, which had been threatening this possibility for months, finally acted on it. There was no search, 3 people barely functional on a small island cannot mount a search of the southern Indian Ocean. There was no ceremony. There was only the absence, which the island absorbed with the same indifference it absorbed everything. 7 became 3. Louise. Julien. Leo. 3 people on a volcanic island, 10 months into a 3-month posting, in the southern Indian Ocean, with a radio none of them could use and a horizon that had shown them nothing but emptiness for season after season. In France, the Great Depression was reorganizing priorities. Companies that had once planned for futures were now managing weeks. The brothers who owned Langoustes Françaises had a ledger full of problems. St. Paul Island was a line item in that ledger, an obligation that could, perhaps, be handled when the next season's ship went out anyway. The logic of this, from inside an office, is almost coherent. The ship will go. They will be on it. The costs are contained. The logic of this, from inside St. Paul Island, is a different thing entirely. December 6, 1930. 10 months after the ship had sailed away. The next season's vessel arrived at St. Paul with new workers, new supplies, and the expectation of finding a functioning guard crew, perhaps thin, perhaps irritable, but essentially intact. What they found were 3 people. The accounts from the arriving crew used the phrase, living skeletons, and while that phrase has become so familiar from historical accounts of starvation that it risks sliding past you, stop and let it land. Louise. Julien. Leo. 10 months of inadequate food, vitamin deficiency, grief, and the specific psychological damage of being promised rescue and watching the horizon give you nothing. Their skin was drawn against their bones. Their eyes were described as too large for their faces, the particular quality of a face from which everything that is not structural has been consumed. They could not speak. They pointed. At the graves. At the places where the island had taken their companions. 4 graves on St. Paul Island. Emmanuel. François. Victor. Pierre. And somewhere in the volcanic earth, too small for a marked grave, Paul, the child who lived 3 weeks. The arriving crew described the 3 survivors with a directness that their own silence demanded. They loaded them onto the ship. The island, which had watched all of this with its characteristic absence of interest, continued doing what it always does. Now here is the detail that changes the story from tragedy to something with a name. Louis, one of the 3 survivors, boarded the departing ship and left. Louise and Leo stayed. Why? The records offer fragments, not answers. The company, which had just arrived for a new season, apparently indicated that workers were needed. Louise, who had just survived 10 months of abandonment, 3 deaths around her, and the burial of her child, apparently agreed to continue. Think about what kind of pressure produces that decision. Think about what Depression-era France looked like to a woman with no money, a dead husband, a dead child, and no certainty that the mainland offered anything better than the island she already knew how to survive. The familiar horror versus the unfamiliar uncertainty. It is not a choice. It is a trap wearing the costume of a choice. The lobster season mattered. The machinery mattered. The ledger mattered. Louise, apparently, was still a resource. The following summer, 1931 into 1932, the factory filled again. More workers from Madagascar, drawn by wages in a world where wages were vanishing. Their diet was dominated by what the island would give them and what could be caught or trapped, fish, penguins, and rats. Primarily rats. And a new disease arrived, wearing a different name but carrying the same logic as the one before it. Beriberi. Caused by the absence of vitamin B1, thiamine, from a diet that contains almost nothing but protein and no whole grains, no legumes, no complex carbohydrates. Like scurvy, beriberi is not a dramatic disease. It is a quiet unraveling, nerves deteriorating, muscles weakening, in some cases the heart failing under a load it no longer has the chemistry to sustain. Over that season, more than 40 men died. 40. The number sits in historical records with the flatness that numbers always have, which is their most dishonest quality. 40 is not a statistic. 40 is Emmanuel's legs swelling in July. It is Francois reading the medical book. It is Victor fading. It is 40 separate bodies failing in 40 separate moments, 40 separate realizations that this was how it was going to end, on a volcanic island in the southern Indian Ocean, far from anyone who knew their name. If the first winter was a tragedy, the second was a crime. The story eventually escaped the island, the way stories do, through the people who survived, through records that persisted, through journalists who found in it the particular combination of corporate indifference and human suffering that makes readers furious rather than simply sad. In 1935, French newspapers began publishing accounts of Les Oubliés de Saint Paul, the forgotten ones of Saint Paul. A court case followed. The language of civilization attempting to process something that had happened beyond civilization's edges: responsibility, compensation, accountability. The Bossier Brothers Company was convicted. Louise was promised compensation. The company went bankrupt. The compensation was never paid. Louise received what St. Paul had always offered her: survival, and then a different kind of abandonment. St. Paul Island is uninhabited today. The factory ruins remain on the northern shore: stone outlines, collapsed walls, the iron skeleton of machinery that the salt air has been dismantling for 90 years. A plaque stands on the island. Another stands somewhere in France. They acknowledge that these events happened, that these names existed. But a plaque cannot convey what Louise pointed at when words failed her. It cannot convey what it means to count the days past a promise that nobody is keeping. It cannot convey the specific quality of an empty horizon when you have been watching it for 10 months and you have buried a child and 3 companions and you are eating rats to stay alive. Here is what St. Paul Island actually teaches, if you are willing to hear it. The ocean is dangerous. The cold is dangerous. Scurvy is dangerous. The southern Indian Ocean in winter is one of the most hostile environments a human being can be placed in. But none of those things decided what happened on St. Paul Island in 1930. What decided it was a decision made in an office, by men in comfortable chairs, that a resupply could wait. That 3 months could become 4. That 4 could become 10. That the people on the other end of that postponement were workers, not persons, resources to be managed rather than human beings to be kept alive. The island didn't abandon them. The company did. And the difference matters. Because the ocean is indifferent, it has no obligation to the people who cross it. A company has an obligation. A contract has an obligation. A promise has an obligation. These are human constructs, built specifically because we decided, at some point in our history, that we owe each other something. The Bossier brothers decided otherwise. 7 names. 3 came back. 1 never received what she was promised. The wind on St. Paul still doesn't care. But we should.